Are you ready for an extraordinary story? It's a story about one woman's perseverance and inventiveness. The woman's name is Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley was born into slavery in Virginia in 1818, and for the first 30 years of her life, Elizabeth dreamed of freedom. She would work hard to purchase that freedom. How did she do it? By becoming a dressmaker and an entrepreneur. In the 19th century, being a dressmaker was the highest paying job a woman could have. And Elizabeth Keckley was one of the best. In only a few years, she rose from slavery to land a position at the president's house. She became the dressmaker and friend of the First Lady of the United States. This is the story of Elizabeth Keckley and her incredible journey to the White House.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Today, we are learning about a very important dressmaker who left her mark on history. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. How could a dressmaker make history? But if there's anything you've learned from this podcast, it's that anyone and everyone leaves a mark on history, and it is our job to make sure those stories are heard. Elizabeth Keckley was a woman determined to change her life, and in the process of doing so, left an impression on the world. So get ready, young historians, because this episode is really going to dress things up.
Our story begins in 1847. Elizabeth is leaning over a piece of fabric with a needle and thread, sewing a dress for one of her customers. Elizabeth, or Lizzie as she was called, had been working hard since she could remember. Born into slavery, Elizabeth had started working when she was just 4 years old. Her first job was to look after a newborn child. To take care of this baby was my first duty, she remembered. Now Elizabeth was 29 years old with a child of her own, her son, George. Elizabeth worked for the Garland family in St. Louis, Missouri. Mr. Garland was not a very rich man and was struggling to make money. He wanted to send Elizabeth's mother to work for another family to make extra money, but Elizabeth wouldn't allow it. No, 1,000 times no, she said. Elizabeth's mother was older, and it would be hard for her to work for a family she didn't know. Elizabeth had an idea. She was very good at making clothes. Why couldn't she use her skills to make money for the Garlands? Then her mother wouldn't have to leave. And do you know what? Her idea worked. In a short time, I had acquired something of a reputation as a seamstress and a dressmaker, Elizabeth said. At that time, you couldn't go to a store to buy a dress, and you definitely couldn't buy a dress online. Clothing had to be made one piece at a time, and it was designed specifically for one person. And Elizabeth's dresses, well, they fit like a glove. Using pins, needles, and sometimes a sewing machine, Elizabeth created beautiful and elegant gowns. When people saw what she could make, the clothing orders started rolling in. Elizabeth was a very busy seamstress. One day, as Elizabeth worked on a dress, she started thinking, maybe there was a way she could buy a better life for herself and her son. She was also thinking about getting married. She did not want her son or any other children she might have to grow up enslaved. Maybe Elizabeth could purchase her freedom. She asked Mr. Garland how much she needed to pay him to be free. He told her to forget about this idea, but she would not let it rest and kept asking. Finally, he changed his mind. He told me I deserved my freedom and that it would take $1,200 for myself and my boy, Elizabeth remembered. Elizabeth worked day and night for the Garland family. For many years, it seemed almost impossible to make extra money for herself, but she came up with a plan. She would travel to New York and collect the money she needed. In the North, there were organizations that helped enslaved people gain their freedom. But as Elizabeth planned her trip north, a carriage pulled up in front of the Garland home. She looked out the window and saw a woman step out. It was Mrs. Le Bourgeois, one of the ladies who bought Elizabeth's dresses. She told Elizabeth not to travel north. You have so many friends in St. Louis, and I'm going to raise the $1,200 required among them, she announced. And Miss LaBourgeois was right. As a good businesswoman, Elizabeth had built a network of loyal clients and friends who did not want to see her go. The money was raised quickly and given to Mr. Garland. At last, my son and myself were free. Free, Elizabeth said. But the money was a loan, and Elizabeth had every intention of paying it back. For years, she worked hard as a seamstress to save every penny. By 1860, she finally had enough to pay off the loan. That year, Elizabeth was ready to begin her next great adventure. She headed to the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. It was not easy at first. In Washington, D.C., she had to get a work permit in order to start her business. Elizabeth also had to find a white person to say that she was a free woman. In St. Louis, that would have been easy, but not here. Elizabeth did not know anyone in Washington. Slowly, she began meeting wealthy ladies who were able to help and eager to buy new dresses. One of them was Mrs. Verena Davis. Verena kept Elizabeth very busy making clothes for the entire Davis family. Elizabeth was often at the family's house late at night, still working. "You know there's going to be a war, Lizzie," Verena asked Elizabeth one day while she was working. This news surprised Elizabeth. "Who will go to war?" she asked. "The North and the South," Verena replied. See, at the time, many southern states were not happy with the direction the country was going, and slavery was a key issue. In the South, many supported slavery and didn't think that the president or the federal government should be able to abolish it. The North and the South were headed towards war. "You had better go south with me," Verena told Elizabeth. "As soon as we go south and secede from the other states, we will raise an army and march on Washington, and then I shall live in the White House." Verena said her husband, Senator Jefferson Davis, would be elected president of the South. Verena was certain the South would beat the North, and then she would become the new First Lady of the United States. But Elizabeth didn't think the North would give up that easy. She decided to stay in Washington, D.C., and that was a wise decision. Because it wasn't long before Elizabeth would be sewing dresses for the real First Lady of the White House. Elizabeth's dresses were admired around the city, and she slowly gained more and more clients. In fact, it wasn't long before she had more work than she could possibly do. It was one of those busy days that the carriage pulled up to her apartment. A lady named Margaret McLean hopped out and rushed over to Elizabeth. "I have not a dress fit to wear. You must start work on it right away," Margaret said. Elizabeth had too much work to do already, and there wasn't enough time. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth began, but Margaret interrupted her. "I have often heard you say that you would like to work for the ladies of the White House. I know Mrs. Lincoln well." Margaret promised she would help Elizabeth meet Mary Todd Lincoln. This was very exciting. In just a few days, Mary's husband, Abraham Lincoln, was going to be sworn in as the nation's president, and Mary Todd Lincoln would become the First Lady of the United States.
Hi, young historians. Time for a quick break from this amazing story to tell you a bit more about Honest History. If you're enjoying this episode, then you'll love Honest History's magazines and books. Each one is filled with important adventures through the past, like the story of Chen Yi Sao, a Chinese woman who commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history, to Mansa Musa from Africa, one of the wealthiest people to ever live. You can pick up a copy or subscribe and receive 3 issues delivered straight to your doorstep every 3 months. Just go to honesthistory.co and use code ANYTIMENOW for a 10% discount. That's honesthistory.co and special promo code ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
Elizabeth had dreamt about making dresses for the White House. Ever since she first moved to Washington, D.C., she'd worked towards this dream. Now, she had a chance. Elizabeth agreed to make a dress for Margaret McLean and worked all day and night. The next Sunday, Elizabeth received a message from Margaret. It read, "Call at my house at 4:00 p.m. Elizabeth had no idea why she was needed and didn't think it was urgent. She decided it would be fine to wait until the next day. On Monday, Elizabeth left her apartment and began walking over to Margaret's house. That morning, the streets were filled with people. It was Inauguration Day of President Abraham Lincoln. Some people were out celebrating, while others were curious to see what would happen. Many people in the South did not want Abraham Lincoln to be president. There had been rumors a war would start between the North and the South. There were also rumors that someone would try to kill the president. It was a strange, tense day in Washington, D.C. Elizabeth pushed through crowds of people until she finally made it to Margaret McLean's home. She knocked on the front door. A man answered. "Mrs. McLean is out, but you are wanted at the hotel across the street," he told Elizabeth. Elizabeth found Margaret at the hotel. "You should have come yesterday," Margaret said. Mrs. Lincoln had requested to see Elizabeth. Margaret gave Elizabeth the number of the First Lady's hotel room and told her to go there. Elizabeth climbed the stairs in excitement and nervousness. Why hadn't Margaret just told her the message was urgent? Hopefully she had not ruined her chances. Elizabeth arrived at the room and knocked on the door. She heard a voice answer, "Come in." Elizabeth opened the door and saw Mary Todd Lincoln standing in front of her. "You are Lizzie Keckley, I believe," she said. Mary told Elizabeth to come to the White House tomorrow morning. Elizabeth left the hotel and walked home, her mind racing. What did Mrs. Lincoln want? Would this be the business opportunity she had dreamt of? It was hard to wait a whole day to find out. In the morning, Elizabeth leapt out of bed and got dressed. She then walked to the White House, the home and office of the president. She had never been inside the grand white building before. When she got to the entrance, she was told to wait in the waiting room. Elizabeth was surprised to see she wasn't alone. There were at least 3 other dressmakers waiting too. One by one, the dressmakers were called in to see Mrs. Lincoln and then asked to leave. Finally, Elizabeth heard her name called. She walked up the stairs and found Mary Todd Lincoln looking out the window. "You have come at last," Mary said when she saw Elizabeth. After a short conversation, it was decided Elizabeth Keckley would become Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker. Truth be told, it got off to a rocky start. Elizabeth made Mary a dress and arrived at the White House to deliver it, but the First Lady threw a fit. She said Elizabeth arrived too late. "I have no time to dress. What is more, I will not dress and go downstairs," she huffed. But Elizabeth knew how to deal with difficult clients. "I can have you ready in a few minutes," Elizabeth said. With urging from Mary's friends, the First Lady finally agreed. Elizabeth dressed Mary quickly and carefully. Soon after, Abraham Lincoln walked into the room and said, "I declare, you look charming in that dress. Miss Keckley has met with great success." And he was right. The dress was a beautiful rose color. It wasn't flashy or over the top. It was sophisticated and elegant, much like its dressmaker. The First Lady beamed. Over the next few years, Elizabeth was able to open her own dress shop and hire 20 assistants. She made dozens of dresses for Mary Todd Lincoln. With so much time spent in the White House, she became friends with the Lincoln family. Elizabeth and the First Lady grew very close. In 1862, the 2 women were pulled even closer. They both had lost their sons. Elizabeth's son, George, was killed in the battle during the Civil War. Mary's son, Willie, died of typhoid fever. Mary struggled after her son's death, and Elizabeth was there to help. "If it had not been for Lizzie Keckley, I don't know what I should have done," Mary said. And in 1865, Elizabeth was there to comfort Mrs. Lincoln on another tragic day, the day Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Send for Elizabeth Keckley. I want her just as soon as she can be brought, Mary said, and a carriage arrived at Elizabeth's apartment to take her to the White House. Mary often depended on Elizabeth's strength. After the president's death, life was very difficult for Mary. She needed money to pay off many debts, and she talked to Elizabeth about selling some of her famous dresses. Elizabeth agreed to help. When Mary's dresses were put up for sale, newspapers criticized both of the ladies. Elizabeth wanted people to hear her side of the story and to help Mary. That's when she decided to write a book about her childhood and time at the White House. She titled it Behind the Scenes. The book was published in 1868 and caused a scandal. Many people were shocked that Elizabeth wrote a book about the Lincolns and their private life. Even Mary Todd Lincoln wasn't happy with the book and felt it betrayed their friendship, but Elizabeth defended herself. If I had betrayed confidence in anything I have published, it has been to place Mrs. Lincoln in a better light before the world. My own character, as well as the character of Mrs. Lincoln, is at stake. Today, Elizabeth's book gives us a glimpse into life at the White House during the Civil War. Most importantly, it tells the story of an extraordinary woman. Elizabeth founded the Contraband Relief Association to help enslaved people seeking freedom. She also helped create a shelter for Black women and children who came to Washington, D.C. After publishing her book, Elizabeth went on to train other Black women to become seamstresses, and later took a position at the University of Ohio. She lived until the old age of 89. My life has been an eventful one, Elizabeth wrote, and historians could not agree more.
Welcome back. What did you think of the story? I think there are several key takeaways from this episode. One is how important it is to have a strong work ethic. Elizabeth Keckley knew she was a gifted dressmaker and used her talents to forge a better life for herself and her family. She worked day and night to earn her freedom and then continued to work for the rest of her life. The second thing is her loyalty. Elizabeth was a loyal friend to Mrs. Lincoln and did everything in her power to protect her friend's reputation. These are two incredible qualities that helped Elizabeth leave her mark on history and change her life for the better. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about women in history, be sure to check out Honest History's books and magazines. You can learn all about Nur Jahan, Mirhama, Anne Boleyn, and more. See you all next time. This episode was hosted by Alyssa Yeoman and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.
When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to